Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting on the lens of critical social science to look way beyond your standard surface-level climate solutions. If you've ever felt like, simply recycling or switching to paper straws just isn't really matching the massive scale of the global climate crisis, well, you're definitely not alone. The academic literature we're unpacking today takes a deep, structural look at our global economic system. We're going to explore how critical researchers view the climate crisis not as some kind of accident, but as a built-in feature of modern capitalism.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for the analysis. We'll start with the roots of the ecological crisis and the era of cheap nature. Then, we'll explore the imperial mode of living, climate and class struggle, social work's climate dilemma, and finally, look beyond green capitalism.
Section 1. The Roots of Ecological Crisis.
To start off, we need to establish the observable reality of our modern climate crisis as our universal starting point. We all see the extreme weather, we see the data, but the fundamental question, the question these researchers are really asking is, why is it happening, and why is it so incredibly hard to stop? According to the critical social science literature we're examining today, the climate crisis isn't just an environmental glitch or, a side effect of bad technology. Authors across these papers argue that it's actually a direct symptom of capitalism's fundamental reliance on extracting natural resources. The core argument here is that an economic system requiring infinite growth will inevitably, absolutely collide with a planet that has finite ecological boundaries.
Section 2. The Era of Cheap Nature. To truly wrap our heads around this collision between the economy and ecology, we have to look back in time through the lens of environmental historian Jason W. Moore. Moore introduces a really fascinating, though pretty sobering concept called cheap nature. He argues that capitalism doesn't just produce things, it actually functions by continually taking unpaid work and energy from both human beings and the natural world. To kind of demystify this jargon a bit, Moore says the system relies on the four cheaps. That's labor, food, energy, and raw materials. For centuries, the global economy has functioned on the assumption that these four things are practically infinite and essentially free for the taking.
And this didn't just start with the smokestacks of the 19th century Industrial Revolution either. Critical theorists argue the ecological crisis traces back centuries. Moore's timeline points to the 1450s with early capitalist origins, and really notably to 1492. In this specific view, Christopher Columbus wasn't just an explorer, he was an early agent of this resource appropriation, basically kickstarting the long 16th century where the colonial commodification of nature truly began.
Now, what's really interesting about this next point is how perfectly Moore frames this. He states, capitalism does not have an ecological regime, it is an ecological regime. He's basically urging us to stop looking at society and nature as two totally separate boxes. We shouldn't think of humanity over here and the environment way over there. Instead, the economic system and the natural world are one entirely intertwined, co-produced system. How we organize money and labor is exactly how we organize nature.
Looking closely at Moore's historical analysis, when Columbus arrived in the Americas, he wasn't just writing in his diary about finding gold. He was actively assessing the trees, the soil, and the people as potential cheap nature. The text highlights how these early colonial voyages were fundamentally about evaluating the natural world to see how it could be plugged right into an economic engine that demanded unpaid energy and labor.
Section 3. The Imperial Mode of Living.
So let's fast forward from those historical roots to right now, our modern era. We're going to introduce the highly influential work of researchers Ulrich Brand and Marcus Wisson, who look at how these centuries-old systems still dictate our lives today. They pose a really critical question. Why does the ecological crisis persist despite widespread global awareness? I mean, think about it. We have the IPCC reports, we have massive global climate summits, we know the science, yet global emissions just keep rising. How do we bridge this massive gap between knowing there is a problem and actually fixing it?
Their answer boils down to a concept they call the imperial mode of living. This is a super powerful lens. It suggests that our everyday, totally normal habits in the global north, driving our cars, heating our large homes, buying the latest smartphone, eating out-of-season produce, are deeply locked into a system of global inequality. Our version of a good life is sustained by invisibly exploiting resources and labor from the global south and then dumping the ecological consequences right back onto them. State policies struggle to fix the climate because this exact way of living is completely normalized.
So the crucial point here is that this imperial mode of living acts as an invisible status quo. It has its roots in colonialism, it completely normalizes exploitation, it pushes the true costs of our lifestyle out of sight, and it is heavily entrenched in our daily habits.
This creates a massive structural barrier to true sustainability because actually dismantling the climate crisis means fundamentally altering what the global north considers a normal, successful life.
Section 4. Climate and class struggle.
Let's shift our focus a bit to how this ecological crisis interacts with traditional social and economic conflicts, drawing on the analysis of Marcus Visson. Visson points out this really fascinating family resemblance between the labor movement and the climate movement. On one side, you have ecological conflicts, which aim to protect nature from capitalist extraction. And on the other side, you have class conflicts, aiming to protect workers from capitalist exploitation. In theory, both groups are fighting against the exact same overarching logic, a logic that treats life and land merely as commodities to be consumed. Yet, historically, these two movements clash all the time. Why is that? Visson explains this through what he calls the Fordist norm of consumption. To put it simply, the shared struggle of workers and environmentalists is fractured because, under our current system, workers financially depend on the very industries that environmentalists want to dismantle. If you're a coal miner or an auto worker, a sudden push to close fossil fuel plants threatens your livelihood, your family, your entire community. The system pits the immediate, very real need for jobs directly against the long-term need for a habitable planet.
Section 5. Social Work's Climate Dilemma.
Let's move to a different angle and see how this builds out in the real world. Zooming back in from all this macroeconomic theory, how do these massive structural ideas impact everyday social infrastructure? We can actually see this through the research of Sarah Hafez and Johanna Girdle on climate-just social work. Think about it. How does the imperial mode of living affect a social worker who is just trying to help a struggling family in a city?
Hafez and Girdle highlight that marginalized groups suffer the absolute hardest from climate impacts, like extreme heat waves or flooding. This places social workers right on the front lines of the ecological crisis. They operate under what's called a triple mandate. First, they have a mandate to society to help reduce emissions and promote sustainability. Second, a mandate to their clients to fiercely advocate for these vulnerable groups hit hardest by climate change. And third, a mandate to the profession itself to continually and critically reflect on their own theories and practices.
But here is where they run into a major dilemma, the value-action gap. The authors argue that simply educating impoverished clients to, live greener is not just ineffective, it can actually be pretty harmful. Poor populations already consume far fewer resources than the wealthy. Telling them to buy expensive organic food or install solar panels completely ignores the systemic barriers they face. Pure awareness just isn't enough when the structures of the imperial mode of living make sustainable choices a luxury that only the rich can afford.
Section 6. Beyond green capitalism.
So, if awareness isn't enough, and our current economic structures are the actual root of the problem, what do the authors propose as a solution? The research by Ronja Morgenthaler and Lassie Feely contrasts two distinct paths. The first is green capitalism. This is heavily market-based and tech-focused. It basically aims to swap out coal for solar panels, but it keeps the exact same global systems of limitless growth and accumulation totally intact. The alternative they discuss is a radical Green New Deal. This concept seeks to move completely beyond capitalist structures, embracing ideas like degrowth, systemic transformation, and actively building non-capitalist spaces where human well-being, rather than profit, is the central goal.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the literature proposes we actually move forward. They lay out 3 concrete steps for transformation. Step 1, understand the theoretical limits of our current system, really recognizing that we simply can't consume our way out of a consumption crisis. Step 2, transform organizational structures from the ground up, whether that's a local social work office or a massive national energy grid. Step 3, build solidary alliances. The authors stress that real change won't come from individual consumer guilt. It's going to come from collective action, uniting labor, social justice, and environmental movements all together.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to reflect upon today. Based on the deep structural critiques we've just unpacked from these authors, are we willing to fundamentally change our imperial mode of living to achieve true climate justice? Or will we continue to rely on the very system that created the crisis to somehow fix it? It's a really complex dilemma for sure, but understanding the deep roots of the issue is the first step toward finding an answer. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive in today's explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.